Secret CIA projects. Don't trust the government. We've all heard those words uttered 1,000 times. For decades, everyone from newscasters and bloggers to conspiracy theorists has continuously banged that drum. Are there things that the government doesn't want you to know? Of course there are. Aren't there also things that you don't want anyone to know? Unless you're a saint, the answer is probably a resounding yes. Join us now as Conspiracy TV takes an in-depth look at the CIA's secret projects. Under its initiative, or by directives from the President of the United States or the National Security Council staff, the Central Intelligence Agency has tried to control public opinion in the United States and abroad. In 1947, the Soviet-dominated Cominform Communist Information Bureau was created by Joseph Stalin. The conference at which Stalin made it was a response of Eastern European countries to attend the July 1947 Paris Conference on the Marshall Plan. Cominform's stated objective was to coordinate the work of communist parties under Soviet direction. Joseph Stalin called the conference in response to divergences among the Eastern European governments on whether or not to attend the Paris Conference on Marshall Aid. In response, the CIA's psychological operators decided that the Cominform-controlled groups could best be countered by Western groups, including intensely anti-communist right-wing groups and groups across the ideological spectrum. Many were oblivious to CIA subsidies, or such knowledge was limited to a few leaders, and therefore these groups were not expected to obey orders. In 1967, several clandestine subsidies to associations and journals became public. A wide range of CIA operations were examined in congressional investigations from 1975 to 1976, including the CIA's ties with journalists. The most extensive discussion of CIA relations with news media from these investigations is in the Church Committee's final report, published in April 1976. The report covered the CIA's ties with both foreign and domestic news media. As far as foreign news media is concerned, the report concluded that the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals worldwide who deliver intelligence for the CIA and attempt to influence opinion through covert propaganda. For domestic media, the report states, approximately 50 of the agency assets are individual American journalists or employees of US media organizations. Fewer than half are accredited by US media organizations. The remaining individuals are non-accredited freelance contributors and media representatives abroad. Over a dozen United States news organizations and commercial publishing houses formerly provided cover for CIA agents abroad. A few of these organizations were actually unaware that they provided this cover. The church report stated that before the report's completion, the CIA had already begun restricting its use of journalists. According to the report, former CIA Director William Colby told the committee that in 1973 he had issued instructions that as a general policy, the agency will not make any clandestine use of staff employees or use publications which have a substantial impact or influence on public opinion. In February 1976, Director George H.W. Bush announced an even more restrictive policy. It stated, effective immediately, the CIA will not enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any US news service, newspaper, periodical, radio or television network or station. By the time the Church Committee report was completed, the report had stated that all CIA contacts with accredited journalists had been dropped. However, the committee noted that the term accredited correspondent meant the ban was limited to individuals formally authorized by contract or issuance of press credentials to represent themselves as correspondents, and non-contract workers who did not receive press credentials, such as stringers or freelancers, were omitted. the CIA urged its field stations to use their propaganda assets to refute those who disagreed with the Warren Report. In April 1967, a dispatch from the CIA headquarters said, "Conspiracy theories have frequently thrown suspicion on our organization, for example by falsely alleging that Lee Harvey Oswald worked for us." The aim of this dispatch is to provide material for countering and discrediting the claims of the conspiracy theorists, so as to inhibit circulation of such claims in other countries. The agency ordered its stations worldwide to discuss the publicity problem with liaison and friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors, and employ propaganda assets to answer and refute the attacks of the critics. Book reviews and feature articles are particularly appropriate for this purpose. In the mid-1990s, the CIA named Chase Brandon, an operations officer assigned to South America, as the liaison to Hollywood. Brandon's film credits include The Recruit, The Sum of All Fears, Enemy of the State, Bad Company, and In the Company of Spies. He has consulted for television programs including The Agency and Alias. He has appeared on Discovery, The Learning Channel, The History Channel, PBS, A&E, and was interviewed on E! Entertainment, Access Hollywood, and Entertainment Tonight. The Guardian journalist John Patterson criticized the CIA after it pulled the original pilot episode of The Agency. It featured the spy masters preventing a plot by a bin Laden-backed terrorist cell to blow up a fictionalized Harrods. The airing of such an episode might have pointed up the real CIA's lack of success in foiling the World Trade Center attacks. Brandon said the agency would not endorse spy games starring Robert Redford and Brad Pitt. The final rewrite showed our senior management in an insensitive light, and we just wouldn't want to be a part of that kind of project, said Brandon, who also withheld approval from 24, a Fox series about a fictionalized intelligence agency named CTU that also suggests all is not hunky-dory in the company's upper echelons. And the Bourne identity based on the 1984 novel by Robert Ludlum was so awful that I tossed it in the burn bag after page 25. In 2012, Tricia Jenkins released a book, The CIA in Hollywood: How the Agency Shapes Film and Television, which further documented the CIA's efforts at manipulating its public image through the entertainment media since the 1990s. The book explains that the CIA has used motion pictures to boost recruitment, mitigate public affairs disasters like Aldrich Ames, bolster its image, and even intimidate terrorists through disinformation campaigns. Now let's examine some of the CIA's covert operations. Project Artichoke was a CIA project researching methods of interrogation. Preceded by Project Bluebird, Artichoke officially began on August 20, 1951, and was operated by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence. The primary goal of Project Artichoke was to determine whether a person could be involuntarily made to perform an act of attempted assassination. The project also studied hypnosis, forced morphine addiction and its subsequent forced withdrawal, and the use of other chemicals including LSD to produce amnesia and other vulnerable states of mind. Project Artichoke led to Project MKUltra, which began in 1953. Artichoke was a mind control program that gathered information from the intelligence divisions of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and the FBI. The project's scope was outlined in a January 1952 memo that asked, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation?" Project Artichoke was the CIA's secret code for conducting interrogation experiments using LSD hypnosis and total isolation, both in-house and overseas. At first, agents used cocaine, marijuana, heroin, peyote, and mescaline, but they increasingly saw LSD as the most promising drug. The subjects who left this project were fogged with amnesia, resulting in faulty and vague memories of the experience. In 1952, LSD was increasingly being given to unknowing CIA agents to determine the drug's effects on unsuspecting people. One record states that an agent was kept on LSD for 77 days. Artichoke researched the potential of dengue fever and other diseases. A declassified Artichoke memo read, "Not all viruses have to be lethal. The objective includes those that act as short-term and long-term incapacitating agents." MK Naomi was the codename for a joint Department of Defense CIA research program lasting from the 1950s through to the 1970s. Unclassified information about the MK Naomi program and the related Special Operations Division is scarce. It is generally reported to be a successor to the MKUltra project, focusing on biological projects, including biological warfare agents specifically, to store materials that could either incapacitate or kill a test subject, and develop devices for the diffusion of such materials. During its first 20 years, the CIA engaged in projects designed to increase US biological and chemical warfare capabilities. Project MK Naomi was initiated to provide the CIA with a covert support base to meet its top-secret operational requirements. The goal was to have a robust arsenal of lethal and incapacitating materials within the CIA's Technical Services Division. This would enable the TSD to serve as a center for supplying biological and chemical materials. Surveillance, testing, upgrading, and evaluating unique materials and items were provided by MK Naomi to ensure that no defects or unwanted contingencies emerged during operational conditions. The US Army's Special Operations Command was assigned to assist the CIA in developing, testing, and maintaining procedures for the biological agents and delivery systems in 1952. The CIA and the SOC modified guns to fire special darts coated with biological agents and poisonous pills. The darts could incapacitate guard dogs, allowing agents to infiltrate the area that the dogs were guarding, and would then be used to awaken the dogs upon exiting the facility. In addition, the SOC was designated to research the potential to use biological agents against other animals and crops. Operation Mockingbird is an alleged large-scale program of the CIA that began in the early years of the Cold War and attempted to manipulate news media for propaganda purposes. According to author Deborah Davis, Operation Mockingbird recruited leading American journalists into a propaganda network and influenced the operations of front groups. In 1975, Church Committee congressional investigations revealed agency connections with journalists and civic groups. In 1973, a document called The Family Jewels was published by the CIA, containing a reference to Project Mockingbird, which was the name of an operation in 1963, wiretapping two journalists believed to be disseminating classified information. The document does not contain references to Operation Mockingbird. In a 1977 Rolling Stone magazine article entitled The CIA and the Media, reporter Carl Bernstein expanded upon the Church Committee's report. He said that around 400 press members were considered to be intelligence assets by the CIA, including New York Times publisher Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, columnist and political analyst Stuart Alsop, and Time magazine. Bernstein documented how overseas branches of major US news agencies had served as the eyes and ears of Operation Mockingbird for many years, which functioned to disseminate CIA propaganda through domestic US media. QAnon supporters have used the term Operation Mockingbird when referring to American media that spread what the supporters consider to be fake news. This brings us to the most infamous CIA project of them all, Project MKUltra. MKUltra was the code name of an illegal human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the US Central Intelligence Agency. The experiments were intended to develop procedures and identify drugs, such as LSD, that the CIA could use in interrogations to weaken individuals and force confessions through brainwashing and psychological torture. MKUltra used numerous methods to manipulate its subjects' mental states and brain functions, such as the covert administration of high doses of psychoactive drugs, especially LSD and other chemicals, electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and verbal and sexual abuse, in addition to other forms of torture. MKUltra was preceded by two drug-related experiments, Project Bluebird and Project Artichoke. It began in 1953, was reduced in scope in 1964 and 1967, and was halted in 1973. It was organized through the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and coordinated with the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories. The program engaged in illegal activities, including using US and Canadian citizens as unwitting test subjects. MKUltra's scope was broad, with activities carried out under research at more than 80 establishments, including colleges and universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The CIA operated using front organizations, although some top officials at these institutions were aware of the CIA's involvement. MKUltra was first brought to public attention in 1975 by the Church Committee of the United States Congress and Gerald Ford's the United States President's Commission of CIA Activities within the United States, also known as the Rockefeller Commission. Investigative efforts were hampered in 1973 by CIA Director Richard Helms's order that all MKUltra files be destroyed. The Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigations relied on the sworn testimony of direct participants and on the small number of documents that survived Helms's order. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents relating to MKUltra, which led to Senate hearings. Some surviving information about MKUltra was declassified in July 2001. According to author Stephen Kinzer, the CIA project was a continuation of the work begun in the World War II-era Japanese facilities and Nazi concentration camps on subduing and controlling human minds. Kinzer wrote that MKUltra's use of mescaline on unwitting subjects was a practice Nazi doctors had begun in the Dachau concentration camp. Kinzer proposes evidence of the continuation of a Nazi plan, citing the CIA's secret recruitment of Nazi torturers and vivisectionists to continue the experimentation on thousands of subjects, and Nazis brought to Fort Derrick, Maryland, to instruct CIA officers on the lethal uses of sarin gas. The project was headed by Sidney Gottlieb, but it began on the order of CIA Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953. It aimed to develop mind-controlling drugs against the Soviet bloc in response to alleged Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean use of mind-controlled techniques of US prisoners of war during the Korean War. The CIA wanted to use similar methods on their captives and was interested in manipulating foreign leaders with such techniques, devising several schemes to drug Fidel Castro. It often conducted experiments without the subject's knowledge or consent. In some cases, academic researchers were funded through grants from CIA front organizations, but were unaware that the CIA was using their work. The project attempted to produce a perfect truth drug to interrogate suspected Soviet spies during the Cold War and explore other mind control possibilities. Sub-Project 54 was the Navy's top-secret perfect concussion program, which was supposed to use suboral frequency blasts to erase memory, but the program was never carried out. Most MKUltra records were destroyed in 1973 by CIA Director Richard Helms, so it has been difficult for investigators to understand the more than 150 funded research sub-projects sponsored by MKUltra-related CIA programs. Declassified MKUltra documents indicate they studied hypnosis in the early 1950s. The experimental goals included creating hypnotically induced anxieties and hypnotically increasing the ability to learn and recall complex written matter, studying hypnosis and polygraph examinations, hypnotically increasing the ability to observe and recall complex arrangements of physical objects, studying the relationship of personality to susceptibility to hypnosis. They conducted experiments with drug-induced hypnosis and anterograde and retrograde amnesia whilst under such narcotics. The CIA exported experiments to Canada, when they recruited British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron, creator of the psychic driving concept which the CIA found interesting. Cameron had been hoping to correct schizophrenia by erasing existing memories and reprogramming the psyche. He commuted from Albany, New York to Montreal every week to work at the Allen Memorial Institute of McGill University, and was paid $69,000 from 1957 to 1964 and more than $579,000 in 2021 to carry out MKUltra experiments known as the Montreal experiments. These research funds were sent to Cameron by a CIA-front organization, the Society for Investigating Human Ecology. As shown in internal CIA documents, Cameron did not know the money came from the CIA. In addition to LSD, Cameron also experimented with various paralytic drugs and electroconvulsive therapy at 30 to 40 times the average power. His driving experiments consisted of putting subjects into drug-induced comas for weeks, and in one case up to 3 months, while playing tape loops of noise or simple repetitive statements. His experiments were often carried out on patients who entered the Institute for Common Problems, such as anxiety disorders and postpartum depression, many of whom suffered permanent effects from his actions. His treatments resulted in urinary incontinence, amnesia, forgetting how to talk, forgetting their parents, and thinking their interrogators were their parents. During this era, Cameron became known worldwide as the first chairman of the World Psychiatric Association and president of both the American Psychiatric Association and the Canadian Psychiatric Association. Cameron was also a member of the Nuremberg Medical Tribunal from 1946 to 1947. His work was inspired and paralleled by the British psychiatrist William Sargent at St Thomas's Hospital London and Belmont Hospital Sutton, who was also involved in the Secret Intelligence Service and experimented on his patients without their consent, causing similar long-term damage. In the 1980s, several of Cameron's former patients sued the CIA for damages, which the Canadian news program The Fifth Estate documented. Their experiences and lawsuit were made into a 1998 television miniseries called The Sleep Room. In the book The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein argues that Cameron's research and contribution to the MKUltra project were not about mind control and brainwashing, but about designing a scientifically based system for extracting information from resistant sources. In other words, torture. Alfred W. McCoy wrote, stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Donald O. Hebb's earlier breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method, referring to first creating a state of disorientation in the subject, and then creating a situation of self-inflicted discomfort in which the disorientated subject can alleviate pain by capitulating. In areas under American control in the early 1950s, primarily Japan, Germany, and the Philippines, the CIA created secret detention centers so that the US could avoid criminal prosecution. The CIA captured people suspected of being enemy agents and other people it deemed expendable to undertake various types of torture and human experimentation on them. The prisoners were interrogated while being administered psychoactive drugs, electroshocked, and subjected to extremes of temperature, sensory isolation, and the like to understand better how to destroy and control human minds. In 1973, a government-wide panic was caused by Watergate CIA Director Richard Helms's order to destroy all MKUltra files. According to this order, most CIA documents regarding the project were destroyed, making a full investigation of MKUltra impossible. However, a cache of some 20,000 documents survived Helms's purge. They had been incorrectly stored in a financial records building and were discovered following a Freedom of Information Act request in 1977. These documents were thoroughly investigated during the Senate hearings of the same year. In December 1974, the New York Times alleged that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic activities during the 1960s, including experiments on US citizens. That report prompted investigations by the United States Congress, in the form of the Church Committee, and by a commission known as the Rockefeller Commission that looked into the illegal domestic activities of the CIA, the FBI, and intelligence-related agencies of the military. In the summer of 1975, Congressional Church Committee reports and the Presidential Rockefeller Commission report revealed to the public for the first time that the CIA and the Department of Defense had conducted experiments on both unwitting and cognizant human subjects as part of an extensive program to find out how to influence and control human behavior through the use of psychoactive drugs such as LSD and mescaline and other chemicals, biological and psychological means. They also revealed that at least one subject, Frank Olson, had died after the administration of LSD. Much of what the Church Committee and the Rockefeller Commission learned about MKUltra was contained in a report prepared by the Inspector General's office in 1963 that had survived the destruction of records ordered in 1973. However, it contained little detail. Sidney Gottlieb, who had retired from the CIA 2 years previously and had headed MKUltra, was interviewed by the committee but claimed to have very little recollection of the activities of MKUltra. The Congressional Committee investigating the CIA research, chaired by Senator Frank Church, concluded that prior consent was obviously not obtained from any of the subjects. The committee noted that the experiments sponsored by these researchers call into question the decision by the agencies not to fix guidelines for experiments. Following the recommendations of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford issued the first executive order on intelligence activities in 1976, which, among other things, prohibited experimentation with drugs on human subjects, except with the informed consent in writing and witnessed by a disinterested party of each such human subject and per the guidelines issued by the National Commission. Subsequent orders by Presidents Carter and Reagan expanded the directive to apply to any human experimentation. In 1977, during a hearing held by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence to look further into MKUltra, Admiral Stansfield Turner, then Director of Central Intelligence, revealed that the CIA had found a set of records consisting of about 20,000 pages that had survived the 1973 destruction orders because they had been incorrectly stored at a record center not usually used for such documents. These files dealt with financing MKUltra projects and contained few project details, but much more was learned from them than from the Inspector General's 1963 report. On the Senate floor in 1977, Senator Ted Kennedy said, "The Deputy Director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program that included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. Several of these tests involved the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects in social situations. At least one death, the result of the alleged defenestration of Frank Olson, was attributed to Olson's being subjected without his knowledge to such experimentation 9 days before his death. The CIA itself subsequently acknowledged that these tests had little scientific rationale. The officers conducting the monitoring were not qualified scientific observers. The issue took much longer to surface in Canada, becoming widely known in 1984 on the CBC news show The Fifth Estate. It was learned that not only had the CIA funded Cameron's efforts, but also that the Canadian government was fully aware of this and had later provided another $500,000 in funding to continue the experiments. This revelation largely derailed efforts by the victims to sue the CIA, as the US counterparts had, and the Canadian government eventually settled out of court for $100,000 to each of the 127 victims. On September 8, 1967, Cameron died after suffering a heart attack whilst he and his son were mountain climbing. None of Cameron's records of his involvement with MKUltra survived because his family destroyed them after his death. The US General Accounting Office issued a report on September 28, 1994, which stated that between 1940 and 1974, the Department of Defense and other national security agencies studied thousands of human subjects in tests and experiments involving hazardous substances. The quote from the study stated that working with the CIA, the Department of Defense gave hallucinogenic drugs to thousands of volunteer soldiers in the 1950s and 60s. Many of these tests were conducted under the MKUltra program and were established to counter perceived Soviet and Chinese advances in brainwashing techniques. Between 1953 and 1964, the program consisted of 149 projects involving drug testing and other studies on unwitting human subjects. Given the CIA's purposeful destruction of most records, its failure to follow informed consent protocols with thousands of participants, the wild nature of the experiments, and the lack of follow-up data, the full impact of MKUltra experiments, including deaths, may never be known. Several known deaths have been associated with Project MKUltra, most notably Frank Olson. Olson, a United States Army biochemist and biological weapons researcher, was given LSD without his knowledge or consent in November 1953 as part of a CIA experiment. He died by suicide by jumping out of a 13th-story window a week later. A CIA doctor assigned to monitor Olson claimed to have been asleep in another bed in a New York City hotel room when Olson fell to his death. In 1953, Olson's death was described as a suicide that had occurred during a severe psychotic episode. The CIA's internal investigation concluded that the head of MKUltra had conducted the LSD experiment with Olson's prior knowledge. However, neither Olson nor the other men taking part in the experiment were informed about the exact nature of the drug until some 20 minutes after its ingestion. The report further suggested that Gottlieb should be reprimanded, as he had failed to consider Olson's already diagnosed suicidal tendencies, which the LSD might have exacerbated. The Olson family disputes the official version of events. They maintain that Frank Olson was murdered because, especially in the aftermath of his LSD experience, he had become a security risk who might divulge state secrets associated with highly classified CIA programs, many of which he had direct personal knowledge. A few days before his death, Frank Olson quit his position as acting chief of the Special Operations Division at Derrick, Maryland, because of a severe moral crisis concerning his biological weapons research. Among Olson's concerns were the development of assassination materials used by the CIA, the CIA's use of biological warfare materials in covert operations, experimentation with biological weapons in populated areas, the collaboration with former Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip's LSD mind control research, and the use of psychoactive drugs during terminal interrogations under a program codenamed Project Artichoke. Later forensic evidence conflicted with the official version of events. When Olson's body was exhumed in 1994, cranial injuries indicated that Olson had been knocked unconscious before exiting the window. The medical examiner termed Olson's death a homicide. In 1975, Olson's family received a $750,000 settlement from the US government. They also received formal apologies from President Gerald Ford and CIA Director William Colby. However, their apologies were limited to informed consent issues concerning Olson's ingestion of LSD. On November 28, 2012, the Olson family filed a suit against the US federal government for the wrongful death of Frank Olson. The case was dismissed in July 2013 due to the 1976 settlement between the family and the government. In the decision dismissing the suit, US District Judge James Boasberg wrote, "While the court must limit its analysis to the four corners of the complaint, the skeptical reader may wish to know that the public records support many of the allegations in the family's suit, far-fetched as they may sound." A 2010 book by H.P. Albarelli Jr. alleged that the 1951 Pont Saint-Esprit mass poisoning was part of MK Delta, and like its successor MKUltra, was a mind control operation run by the CIA that Olson was involved in, and that the CIA eventually murdered him. However, academic sources attribute the incident to ergot poisoning through a local bakery. The revelations about the CIA and the Army prompted several subjects or their survivors to file lawsuits against the federal government for conducting experiments without informed consent. Although the government aggressively, and sometimes successfully, sought to avoid legal liability, several plaintiffs did receive compensation either through a court order, out-of-court settlement, or act of Congress. Previously, the CIA and the Army actively sought to withhold incriminating information, even as they secretly provided compensation to the families. One subject of Army drug experimentation, James Stanley, an Army sergeant, brought an important, albeit unsuccessful suit. The government argued that Stanley was barred from suing under the Ferris Doctrine. In 1987, the Supreme Court affirmed this defense in a 5-4 decision that dismissed Stanley's case, known as the United States versus Stanley. The majority argued that a test for liability that depends on the extent to which particular suits would call into question military discipline and decision-making would require judicial inquiry into, and hence intrusion upon, military matters. In dissent, Justice William Brennan argued that the need to preserve military discipline should not protect the government from liability and punishment for severe violations of constitutional rights. It claimed that the medical trials at Nuremberg in 1947 deeply convinced the world that experimentation with unknowing human subjects is morally and legally unacceptable. The United States Military Tribunal established the Nuremberg Code as a standard against judging German scientists who experimented with human subjects. In defiance of this principle, military intelligence officials began surreptitiously testing chemical and biological materials, including LSD. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing a separate dissent, stated that no judicially crafted rule should insulate from liability the involuntary and unknowing human experimentation alleged to have occurred in this case. Indeed, as Justice Brennan observes, the United States played an instrumental role in the criminal prosecution of Nazi officials who experimented with human subjects during the Second World War. The standards that the Nuremberg military tribunals developed to judge the defendant's behavior stated that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential to satisfy moral, ethical, and legal concepts. If this principle is violated, the very least that society can do is to see that the victims are compensated as best they can be by the perpetrators. Another lawsuit was filed by Wayne Ritchie, a former US Marshal. After hearing about the project's existence in 1990, he alleged that the CIA had laced his food or drink with LSD at a 1957 Christmas party, which resulted in his attempting to commit a robbery at a bar and his subsequent arrest. While the government admitted it was, at that time, drugging people without their consent, US District Judge Marilyn Hall Patel found that Ritchie could not prove he was one of the victims of MKUltra, or that LSD caused his robbery attempt, and dismissed the case in 2005. American poet Allen Ginsberg first took LSD in an experiment on Stanford University's campus, where he could listen to records of his choice. He chose a Gertrude Stein reading, a Tibetan mandala, and Richard Wagner. He said the experience resulted in a slight paranoia that hung on all my acid experiences through the mid-1960s until I learned how to disperse that from meditation. He became an outspoken advocate for psychedelics in the 1960s. After hearing suspicions that the experiment was CIA-funded, he wrote, "Am I, Allen Ginsberg, the product of one of the CIA's lamentable, ill-advised, or triumphantly successful experiments in mind control?" Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, volunteered for MKUltra experiments involving LSD and other psychedelic drugs at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park. At the same time, he was a student at nearby Stanford University. Keyes' experiences under the influence of LSD inspired him to promote the drug outside of the context of the MKUltra experiments, which influenced the early development of hippie culture. Robert Hunter was an American lyricist, singer, songwriter, translator, and poet, best known for his association with Jerry Garcia and the Grateful Dead. Along with Ken Kesey, Hunter was said to be an early volunteer for MKUltra at Stanford University. Stanford test subjects were paid to take LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, and then report on their experiences. These experiences were creatively formative for Hunter, who wrote, "Sit back and picture yourself swooping up a shell of purple, with foam crests of crystal drops, soft night they fall unto the sea of morning, creep very softly mist, and then sort of cascade tinkly bell-like. Must I take you by the hand, ever so slowly type, and then conglomerate suddenly into a peal of silver, vibrant uncomprehendingly, blood-singlingly, joyously resounding bells? By my faith, if this be sanity, then for the love of God permit me to remain insane." Boston mobster James Whitey Bulger alleged he had been subjected to weekly injections of LSD and subsequent testing while in prison in Atlanta in 1957. Ted Kaczynski, an American domestic terrorist known as the Unabomber, was said to be a subject of a voluntary psychological study alleged by some sources to have been a part of MKUltra. As a sophomore at Harvard, Kaczynski participated in a study described by author Alston Chase as a purposely brutalizing psychological experiment led by Harvard psychologist Henry Murray. In total, Kaczynski spent 200 hours as part of the study. Lawrence Teeter was the attorney for Sirhan Sirhan, who was convicted of murdering Robert F. Kennedy, and he believed that Sirhan was operating under MKUltra mind control techniques. After retiring in 1972, Gottlieb dismissed his entire effort for the CIA's MKUltra program as useless. The CIA insists that MKUltra-type experiments have been abandoned. MKUltra plays a part in many conspiracy theories due to its nature and the destruction of most records. Over the years, the MKUltra program has made its way to the big and small screens and beyond. MKUltra features in the plot of the 2017 motion picture Solver. The CBC miniseries The Sleep Room dramatizes brainwashing experiments funded by MKUltra that were performed on Canadian mental patients in the 1950s and 60s, and their subsequent efforts to sue the CIA. In Season 2, Episode 19 of Bones, Spaceman in a Crater, Jack Hodgins mentions that Frank Olson was an unwitting participant and committed suicide. Still, an exhumation 45 years later proved he was murdered. In Season 2, Episode 4 of The Blacklist, Dr. Linus Creel number 82, the task force investigates a possible social experiment in human mind control, supposedly continuing MKUltra's work. Wormwood is a 2017 American 6-part docudrama miniseries directed by Errol Morris and released on Netflix. The series is based on the life of the scientist Frank Olson and his involvement in Project MKUltra. In Season 2, Episode 9 of The Umbrella Academy, 743, Vanya Hargreaves is tortured with electric shocks under the influence of LSD. Project MKUltra's experiments inspired this scene. The 6-episode CBC investigative podcast Brainwashed explores what took place at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal and the CIA's covert mind control experiments, from the Cold War and MKUltra to the so-called War on Terror. In truth, we may never know what's true and what's not regarding the CIA. However, that is the point of it. Join us next time for another thought-provoking episode of Conspiracy TV.